Surah al-Anfal, Surah number 8 of the Quran, Ayat 2, 3 and 4. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the qualities of the mu'mineen, the believers. Of course, initially if you just read it, it just seems a very simple ayat. But if you see there is a link between 5 things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إنما المؤمنون الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم وإذا تليت عليهم آياته زادتهم إيمانا وعلى ربهم يتوكلون الذين يقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون. It's interesting the sequence of the 5 attributes of the mu'mineen. The very first one, الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم. That these are the people whose heart are filled with fear when Allah is mentioned. This is the initial stage of a mu'min. Here, of course, wajilat is in the meaning of fear of displeasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that has very serious consequences. And so whenever they hear the name of Allah or remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that sense is there. And I think if you look at our own lives, the most important element which can prevent us from disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is this sense of having consciousness of His being in our life. Many times people might be in a situation, but when they realize the zikr of Allah comes in mind, that itself prevents that person from moving further in disobedience. And once that element comes into the heart, then the second stage comes in. وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا. And then when the ayat of Quran are recited to him, or he himself starts reciting the ayat of Quran, it gradually increases them in Iman and faith. So you have this zikr of Allah, which creates fear in heart. Then you have the tilawat of the ayat of Quran, which increases the Iman. And this is something we'd always keep in mind, that there is always this chance of Iman, being increased and becoming more and more. We talk about the issue of, the levels of Iman, darajat of Iman. And once a person has that higher level of Iman, زادتهم إيمانا, then this state comes in where وَعَلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ. Then they basically put their trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have that, zikr of Allah in the heart. Then you have this ayat of Quran increasing your Iman. That brings you to a level of tawakkul ala Allah, to trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all your affairs. And after that, basically, we come to the stage, الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةِ. Then a person is in that situation where, they will perform the prayers as a way of fulfilling Allah's right on them. And the 5th thing, وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. They do not only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they spend in charity from what Allah has provided them. And this is a way of fulfilling the rights of the fellow people around us. And then in the next ayat, Allah concludes by saying, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. These are the true believers. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ حَقًّا لَهُمْ دَرَجَاتٍ. Their diverse ranks and levels in the Rabbihim, with their Lord, And they also have maghfiratun wa rizqun kareem, and they will be given forgiveness as well as generous provision from their Lord. So we see that this issue of having this sense of Allah's presence in our life on a spiritual level, on the level of heart, creates this sense of humility to Him, the sense of even fear of displeasing Him. And that becomes a very powerful element to elevate our spiritual status. And this is where, and then the Quran comes in, the ayat of Quran, listening to it, reading it, that itself, creates this level of Iman going up. And that creates the state where we have tawakkul and trust on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, with that comes worshipping Him and also being charitable to those who are around us. Just talking about this element of tawakkul, it reminds me of a very interesting, example from the late Imam Khomeini. This is just few months after just a year into the first year of the revolution, when some of these students, and this was not something initiated by the government. The government at that time was the interim government because the constitution had not yet been formulated. There was no elections, and what's his name, Mohandas Bazargan was the first interim prime minister, and what had happened is that Shah had fled Iran. He was in Mexico, suffering from cancer or something, and there was an issue of him, going to New York for treatment. And at that time, Iran had already been, in a way, bitten by CIA's coup in 50s when Mossadegh, the first elected prime minister, was overthrown. The Shah had fled Iran at that time also, and it was the CIA and even UK intelligence got together. They created a coup of a democratically elected, government, first one in Iranian history, and they brought the Shah back. And so the Iranians had already seen that, bitter test. And so when the issue was that, the Shah of Iran should be allowed to come to US for treatment on humanitarian grounds, his friends like Kissinger and others were pushing for it, although he was not in power at the time. Carter was the president. But the Iranians were very much apprehension of that issue. They were saying he should not be allowed. And if he is allowed, you should arrest him and send him back to Iran. And that's what actually happened because of the pressure from Kissinger and his lobby. The government, on what they call humanitarian grounds, allowed the Shah to come to New York, apparently for treatment. It could be that way, but that created this situation where the student groups in Tehran decided to go and occupy the U.S. embassy, and that is the basis of this, what is known as the hostage crisis in the early days of the revolution. Anyway, that was just the background. I was in Iran at that time, and I remember that Bazargan came to, he was a very pious man, no doubt about it, a very religious man, not a cleric. And that's why he was selected as the first interim prime minister. He was, in a way, same circle as Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi, but as a layman, promoting Islam among the university students. But after all, he came to Imam Khomeini and said, diplomatic immunity is very serious in international laws, and we cannot allow this. Somehow, although it was not done initiated by the government allowed it to happen in that way. And there was concern that maybe America will attack, and we don't have the ability to resist them. The words that we heard at that time was when this Bazargan explained the whole situation. Imam Khomeini, he listened to everything. At the end, he turned around and he said, are you afraid of being killed? Are you afraid of dying? This was his only response. What can they do to us other than, and that was the end of discussion. But from there I'm talking about this issue of tawakkul ala Allah. Iranians didn't know what's happening. Americans planned the rescue mission, and their planes and helicopters landed in the desert of Tabas, south of Mashhad, in a desert area. And this is the thing we should know. Americans were very close allies and friends with the Shah's government. In spite of being friends, they had done things in the backyard of Iran that even Iranians didn't know. There was a landing strip there in the desert. Nobody knew about it. But they have all these things, planned from, that if ever it comes to that situation, we would have something. And so they landed there somehow, and that was their stage where they would then go to Tehran to rescue the Americans. At that time, one of the helicopters, landing because of the desert and the sandstorm also started. They were not able to see things properly. In landing, it hit another helicopter, and there was explosion and fire, and the entire mission was aborted. I think 8 or 11 of them were killed. They died. It was, I think, the main news of the radio, I still remember it was 1 in the afternoon when the news came out. And it's interesting that Americans announced that first. Iranians came to know later on. So they didn't even know what was happening, that the mission was there, it was aborted. And this is where we should always remember that if you have that level of tawakkul on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah comes to the help in that situation. It becomes more like the story of the Ababi. The tawakkul that the grandfather of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said when he talked to Abraha, Abraha said, when I looked at you, I found you to be a very noble person, and even if you had asked me to take my army back and not attack the Kaaba, I would have done that. But I see you're only asking for your own camels, that's all, that our people have, taken them. Abdul Muttalib has said that, I am the owner of the camels, and the owner of the house is there. I will take care of my things, and he will take care of his own things. And that was, the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dealt with the army of Abraham. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, keep the Shia community under his protection. Give us all the level of tawakkul which is for the mu'mineen, inshallah. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار برحمتك يا رب.